industry, this lobby, it's a political lobby, but this lobby managed to actually go inside the different departments, educational departments, whether we're talking about right now in science or biology or psychology and the women's studies and the philosophy studies and all of these different things. And without us recognizing, if we don't actually identify our places, we are also going to be consumers. And that's what's happening with a lot of the Muslims right now. They're actually consumers to these products because these topics are not clear to them. I mean, it is important, and we definitely know it's important to learn, the pillars of Islam and learn certain things. But these issues and these topics are not at all side topics or just a topic that's a secondary topic. If we don't recognize the foundation that this is actually aqidah, then we're really in serious trouble. So that's why I like covering these topics, because this acts as the basis to our understanding and how we view the world around us. It's to take away the different misconceptions out there. And this is to help the Muslims themselves that are right now entering universities, taking these classes and gender studies and all these different things, and then becoming a PhD in psychology and who knows what. And then they become the Muslim therapist that is in hijab, but then she's speaking in kufr when she doesn't even recognize, because of this. So this industry that is right now infiltrated by the different lobbies that are out there. Let us start and actually talk about this. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us that there is a law that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had created in nature. This law, in where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, فَاطِرُ السَّمَاوَاتِ وَالْأَرْضِ جَعَلَ لَكُم مِّنْ أَنفُسِكُمْ أَزْوَاجًا وَمِنَ الْأَنْعَامِ أَزْوَاجًا. This law of binary, in where this binary law in nature does not apply on Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, but the most important thing to get to is that at the end, the Lord Almighty had created these laws in nature, and you're not actually supposed to go against the nature of it, because the second you go against the nature of it, that's that same second that you had actually went against your own nature, and therefore you had determined suicide on yourself and even on the society. Which is why Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, after telling us about this nature, about this law that He had created in nature, then tells us, شَرَعَ لَكُم مِّنَ الدِّينِ مَا وَصَّى بِهِ نُوحًا. In other words, He had then permitted a particular deen. And this is extremely important to mention, because when we're actually talking about the subject of feminism and the subject of masculinity and all these different things, we would think of it, oh, it's just a secondary thing where it's just a just a side talk. Actually, this is part of the deen. This is aqidah that we're learning here. How Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala created nature, how Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala created masculinity, femininehood, and what are those lines, who defines them, etc. This is actually deen. This is not some talk in where we're just here just for the fun of it, or going into philosophical talks that are not necessarily practical. As a matter of fact, after Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala speaking about that, not only does He tell you شَرَعَ لَكُم مِّنَ الدِّينِ, in order to make sure that you're guarding the deen, guarding the religion, guarding the laws, guarding the legislature that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had sent and revealed onto Prophet Nuh, and revealed onto Prophet Ibrahim, onto Prophet Musa, onto Prophet Isa. But He basically tells us then, an aqimuddin, you have the responsibility to establish, to maintain, to preserve the deen, the nature, the laws that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had created in people and sent even onto the different prophets as a revelation, to maintain this as a deen. because the second that you actually go off the track, the second you go off that line that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had basically sent onto the prophets, and even off the line that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala created in nature, you basically are going to come to an encountering that, guess what? The mushrikeen, the different disbelievers, and the different groups that are right now wearing different hats, not necessarily in the name of religion, but in reality, it is actually a religion. The LGBT is a religion. It's a postmodernism is a religion. What is happening right now is that we're actually getting a lot of Muslims embracing this religion and really becoming the consumers of this industry. And when they don't recognize their lines, when they don't recognize their lines, they become easy consumers for to this industry. And then they start becoming the ones to sell it to the Muslims and give it an educational name, an educational labeling. And it seems like it's coming from science, like it's coming from education. And I get this often, where I would get somebody telling me, well, my therapist told me that I should be doing this and this. And I would say, wait a minute, your therapist, many times they don't recognize, and they don't actually recognize the difference between the narrative and how we read the data and what is actually coming from solid science. And this is very often in where then the person would come to me and say, well, my therapist told me such and such, and would assume that I have to change the dean to succumb to what the therapist is saying, because they don't recognize that what the therapist is saying is not necessarily what science is saying, but is more infiltrated by different industries, by different politicians, by different groups, different lobbies, in order to interpret different data in a certain way, in where certain departments have a definition of what makes human, what makes something as right, what makes justice, what makes philosophy, what makes morality, what makes female, what makes male, and the list goes on and on. And that's why Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells you, you're going to find this opposition. They're going to like it. The mushrikeen, they're not going to like what you're going to present at them. But in the end, is that the Lord Almighty is the one that actually has the right and the upper hand to define justice and to define morality and to define these laws. At the end of the day, those that submit to the Lord Almighty, submit to the definitions of the Lord Almighty, are the ones that are actually going to be fighting guidance. But at the end of the day, you just have to recognize that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the one that actually created these boundaries, these definitions of humanhood, manhood, femininehood, the list goes on and on, is basically to be defined by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And that's why when you look at this modern battle, it actually is what the shaitan himself, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, quoted when he was saying, "Wala udillannahum, wala umanniyannahum," I will misguide them and I will get them into some kind of a delusion, some kind of a manipulation, and I will order them to even change the cattle, change the different things in nature, from cattle, from the animal nature, and to even change the creation of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, which is what we're living today. Like never before did we in our nature, in our society, get that far in changing the creation of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And right now we're seeing Muslims easily speaking about making all the changes and not recognizing that this is actually something that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had told us and warned us about, that shaitan will use this method to change you on the outside, to change you, whether change your that so-called transgender, or to change your face and putting all these different whether it's Botox or these different fillers and these different enhancements in the body, in order to change you on the inside, to make you focus to appear on the outside rather than focus on changing on the inside. And again, وَمَن يَتَّخِذِ الشَّيْطَانَ وَلِيًّا مِّن دُونِ اللَّهِ فَقَدْ خَسِرَ خُسْرَانًا مُبِينًا. And whoever takes the shaitan as their authority, then in that same second, that's when they had actually made the complete loss. In other words, they might have actually thought that they were making an energy to invest to bring about a better change, when in reality, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is telling you what you're actually investing in is really a wasted investment, because the money that you're putting, the energy that you're putting, the pains that you're going through in order to change the outside is really nothing but a loss for you, because you're going against your nature. You're putting in this investment in a thing that will actually get you into more pains, into more regression in your humanity, and more regression even in your principles. And here Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us, ya'iduhum, he'll just promise you and give you these manipulations that you'll look nicer, you'll get more acceptance, people will actually give you more advantage, you'll get more advantages and probably get better privileges. But then وَمَا يَعِدُهُمُ الشَّيْطَانُ إِلَّا غُرُورًا. What shaitan is promising you and the delusion that you're living is just nothing but a manipulation that you will embrace. And this is extremely scary, because we are living a manipulation like never before. But if we have our society, even the Muslim society right now, living this kind of manipulation, even though it is so obvious, I wonder when the Dajjal comes, are we really going to be able to face such a manipulation that the Dajjal would come with? This is extremely scary, because the battle right now that we're living, there's this battle of men, women battle, etc. It is so obvious. We know that we've got an XX and an XY chromosome. We know that in nature. We know that in science. But if we can have Muslims actually get into this confusion, this manipulation, and not even recognize something so obvious, actually easily get manipulated, we are really in a dangerous spot. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala was telling us how this is part of changing the creation, and how Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, by changing the fitrah, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us what he had created, the heavens and the earth and everything that is in between them, in 6 days, and then he went onto the throne. He basically put in a tadbir, put in the management, put in the certain numbering in the skies and the earth, and then the Lord Almighty had given everything a certain number. It's a calculated thing. It's not at all of anything absurdity. But then the most important thing that he had created, الذي أحسن كل شيء خلق وبدأ خلق الإنسان من طين. One of the best thing that the Lord Almighty had perfected is basically the creation of mankind. And he had created man from teen, from clay, and then continued his reproduction to be through the fluid, and through that fluid. Now, what you see right there is that the Lord Almighty is telling us that there is the structure. The second you go against the structure is the second that you actually go against your own self. The second you go against your own self is the same second that you ruin the structure. The second you ruin the structure, you basically go against your own life, against your own peace, against your own security, against your own stability, against your own nature. Once you go against your own nature, you go against the whole society's nature. When you go against the whole society's nature, that's when you are bringing nothing but destruction to the whole world and to the whole society. That's why the word fasad is actually mentioned in the Quran. That is fasad. Fasad is when a person goes against their own structure, when they basically ruin the basis of what makes from the very beginning to the accumulated structure of different things that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala created. Once you ruin that, it becomes like a whole Lego. Boom, it just falls one after another. And without us recognizing, we had just demolished the whole foundation, the beautiful foundation that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala created this world in. But you still cannot forget that there's some form of superiority that is taking place right now in the society. How do we understand that one? Well, that's why in Islam, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, يَا أَيُّهَا النَّاسُ إِنَّا خَلَقْنَاكُمْ من ذكر وأنثى وجعلناكم شعوبا وقبائل لتعارفوا إن أكرمكم عند الله أتقاكم إن الله عليم خبير. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala was defining that, yes, some people may recognize certain differences, but superiority is not based on race, blood, kind, but is actually based on living the principles of the Lord Almighty. In other words, when we're actually looking at Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, well, we created you from male, female, and created you from male, female, and even created you nations and tribes, and in order for you to learn from one another. But the most superior of you, the most not superior, but the most honorable one of you is really the one that is atqakum. So what is atqakum? What is taqwa? How do we actually live taqwa? The one to bring about the principles of the Lord Almighty. What does that even mean? In other words, the one to actually be in the highest level of bringing in the structure, living in the nature, living in the principle of the Lord Almighty is the most superior. What does that actually mean? Here Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, وَعْلَمُوا, in order to explain to you what it means to have taqwa, what it means to live rushd, what it means to be salih, what it means to be pious, what it means to actually live and embrace this level of what is called taqwa. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, and know that the Prophet is amongst you. If you were to obey you in the different matters, you would actually go into more struggles. In other words, the matters that you base off your own desire are really bringing you nothing but more and more struggle, even though your body may be manipulating you and telling you that it's actually for your sake. So here Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, well, if you really want to live guidance, really want to live in that superiority, to be an honorable person, here it is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says and gives you that rule. وَلَكِنَّ اللَّهَ حَبَّبَ إِلَيْكُمُ الْإِيمَانَ. He made faith beautiful unto you, that is embracement, Islam. وَزَيَّنَهُ فِي قُلُوبِكُمْ. And he had beautified the different parts of faith to be beautified for you, in where you beautify that, where Iman is beautified in your heart, you recognize a very important thing. That the reason why you adore and why you want to apply Islam is because you recognize that is more beautiful. That's why the Prophet ﷺ actually says, لا يؤمن أحدكم حتى يكون هواه تبعا لما جئت به. You would not be a believer until your own desires go in congruence with what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had sent the Prophet with. Let's continue. But it's not enough to love something. And he says, وَكَرَّهَ إِلَيْكُمُ الْكُفْرَ وَالْفُسُوقَ وَالْعُصْيَانَ. And he had made it hated to you? Disbelief, fisq, sin, major sin, and even minor sin. That's what it means to actually be in living in honor and living in superiority. So it's not necessarily related to not the tribe, not the race, and certainly not male or female. Well, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala lays out that foundation, but still, we definitely still recognize that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala did consider that there are different roles, different natures that He had created in men and women. Well, which is why Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala here, what makes manhood and masculinity? Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had used the term dhakar, which means male, and used the term rajul, which actually means man, in different contexts, and had and had used the term rajul as another term to show and reveal masculinity, to be at a higher level than just being a dhakar. Dhakar, just boy, male. But rajul is masculinity. It's chivalry. It's another level. That's why Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, let's look at some of those ayat and actually see what it looks like. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, quoting the man that was debating in Surah Al-Kahf, his friend that was boasting for the money that he had and boasting over all the privileges that he had. And he assumed that the privilege that he had was simply feeling that he was at a better level, at an honorable level, and therefore more making him more superior since he had the financial privileges. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us how that other man responded to him. He tells him, أَكَفَرْتَ بِالَّذِي خَلَقَكَ? Would you disregard and would you deny the Lord Almighty that had created you from dust and then created you into a sperm, and then He made you into a man? Now, here's one thing. This is in order to tell us that the most important part about masculinity is when they're capable of defining their source of recognition, il-wahi. When their recognition is in place to regard il-wahi, to regard that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is their source of information, is their source of recognition, that's the most important thing about masculinity. But if they're confused about their epistemology, and if they're confused about their resources of recognition, then they are simply lacking the main tool to help them recognize their decision making. And that's why in Islam, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala forbid a woman from marrying a non-Muslim man, whether he is from Ahl al-Kitab or whether he is from another religion, because if this man is lacking that masculinity to be the main foundation qawama, they couldn't even recognize their place of recognizing right and wrong, which is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, then they're definitely not qualified to be the decision makers on her behalf. Then therefore they're not qawam anymore, because they basically could not even figure out the main source of knowledge, let alone figure out the details of decision making. And that's why Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala right there says, وَمَا أَرْسَلْنَا مِن قَبْلِكَ إِلَّا رِجَالًا نُوحِي إِلَيْهِمْ. All the previous messengers that had come before you, O Muhammad sallam, they were men that were given the revelation. In other words, they were basically given a revelation but they were actually meant to be in the position to deliver the message, be strong enough to carry out the message and carry out the mission. So, what is the basis of manhood after all? When you say man, and sometimes you would use the word man, I'm just going to use the word man to mean the rajul, to mean the rajul, and not necessarily to mean dhakar here. So, what is the basis of manhood then in Islam? Number one, recognizes the principle and its basis. We just talked about that. Number two, after recognizing the principle, they would act upon the principle. They would put it into practice. They would act responsible. They would recognize that they're people on a mission. And that's why Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala right there actually emphasized and said, well, what does it mean to be a person and a man on a mission? وَذَا لَا تُلْهِيهِمْ تِجَارَةٌ وَلَا بَيْعٌ عَنْ ذِكْرِ اللَّهِ. They're men that will not be pacified, not because of business, not in a situation where they're concerned about business or even anything that might actually come as a distraction from dhikrillah, from considering that the priority is the name of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, is the mission, is basically iqam as-salah, ita az-zakah. They're considering and they're recognizing that there's nothing to distract them away from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. That is the main mission. Why? Because they actually take the mission from the prophets and the messengers, and they consider the mission and the center to be Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. In other words, the reason why, even though carrying out a business is supposed to be a good thing, but there are different levels of what actually is a priority. The priority is not dunya, but priority is akhirah. And that's why Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala would actually speak about what it means to live manhood. They're guided by principle and mind, not emotions or impulsiveness. Why? Because the second, when you look at that ayah, in where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala speaks about لَمَسْجِدٌ أُسِّسَ عَلَى التَّقْوَى, the story behind this masjid أُسِّسَ عَلَى التَّقْوَى and the masjid dirar, the munafiqeen, they basically built another masjid in Medina. The munafiqeen built a masjid. Yes, the munafiqeen built a masjid. And this is extremely important because you can have munafiqeen building a masjid. You can have munafiqeen actually having an Islamic organization. And without you recognizing, it is nothing but a place of manipulation that's actually taking the ummah elsewhere. You can have somebody have a burden, and have a PhD in Islamic studies without you recognizing they're nothing but munafiqeen, bringing in a manipulation. If they are not guided by principle, then you've got a problem. How do I know if they're guided by principle? You have to have the ilm to recognize who's guided by principle and who's guided by emotions and who's actually guided by just al-hawa, by their desire. And that's why Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us the story. لَمَسْجِدٌ أُسِّسَ عَلَى التَّقْوَى مِنْ أَوَّلِ يَوْمٍ. The masjid that was built on taqwa, on piety, on the basis of Allah Almighty from the very first day, is basically the masjid that you should be sitting in. Why? Because in that masjid, that is the masjid al-taqwa, is basically containing fihi rijal, the real men, that love what? That love purity. And the Lord Almighty loves those that are pure. What is purity? Purity is in 5 different things. They're pure in their deen. They're pure. They recognize the ilm. They recognize their foundations too. They're pure even in recognizing their life. They want to live on principle. 3, they're pure in their mental health. They're pure in recognizing the choices that they make and the choices in their education, the choices in what they consume to maintain a good, healthy mind. They're pure in the way their social relations are built and the way they recognize who to cancel out of their life and their social relations and who to bring in their social relations. And finally, they're pure in income and they recognize what makes a pure income and recognize what makes a pure distribution and what makes a pure investment, and they recognize how to live these bases. And this is extremely important because they don't live based on emotions. They're not impulsive, but they're actually acting in a strong capacity to live the principle, to face the challenges, and does not surrender to the challenges. In other words, they learned how to live up to those, live up to facing those challenges by recognizing. So what happened? Let's see another story. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala then uses again the word رجل. وجاء من أقصى المدينة رجل قال يا قوم اتبعوا المرسلين اتبعوا من لا يسألكم أجرا وهم مهتدون. And then continues وما لي لا أعبد الذي فطرني وإليه ترجعون. A man came from far away. What was he saying? He was basically telling the people he was alone. He was reminding and telling the people to follow Prophet Musa alayhi salam. اتبعوا المرسلين, follow the messengers. He was basically what? Living a man of a mission. Who? اتبعوا من لا يسألكم أجرا. Follow the one that won't ask you for a pay. Follow the one that is not seeking any type of a privilege in this dunya, but they're actually asking for a privilege in akhirah. They're the ones that are guided. In other words, what is the most important thing about manhood? They recognize their places of celebrity, my friends. They recognize who they follow. They don't use their emotions to determine who they should follow, but they recognize that the most important principle that they follow is basically the principle of the Lord Almighty. And what? وَمَا لِيَ لَا أَعْبُدُ الَّذِي فَطَرَنِي. And why should I not worship the one that had created me, that had created me in a pure nature? Because I recognize وَإِلَيْهِ تُرْجَعُونَ, because I recognize that our return is going to be to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So what should I do? I basically stand firm. That's the most important thing about masculinity, is when he's actually firm, he's actually considering the principles, he's recognizing that the principles are supposed to be the areas of leadership, and it's not an issue of our own whims. It's the principle that guides. It's Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that guides. It's basically Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that guides. In where? In order for me to look for solutions and not excuses to give up on my responsibilities, would basically go back to Quran and Sunnah. And why? Because they recognize that the real fear that they should be afraid of is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and not the consequences of what it means to probably live the word of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And that's why, let's look at this ayah. قال رجلان من الذين يخافون أنعم الله عليهما ادخلوا عليهم الباب فإذا دخلتموه فإنكم غالبون وعلى الله فتوكلوا إن كنتم مؤمنين. Two of the men, they basically said, even though there were different threats that are probably just surrounding them, they said, and in opposition to all the fears that everyone was living, They just said, just enter through the door. If you enter it, then you had been in victory. Why did it actually want to say that? Because a true man, even if the whole society goes in their opposition, a true man stands up to live the principle, even if the whole society lived at a different path. A true man does not follow his whims, and a true man does not emulate what everybody else is doing. A true man lets the principle determine the definitions of justice, where to be firm in, and they're courageous, just even it may cost them their own life. They'll stand up for it. They'll stand up for help, even if the price actually meant their own life and their own wealth. So what happens? In order, وَمِنْهُمْ مَنْ يَنْتَظِرُ وَمَا بَدَّلُوا تَبْدِيلًا. They recognize that some of those, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala actually described those men, that some of them are actually waiting to be next in line, in the whole line of the legacy, the prophets and the messengers, and the legacy of those salihin that had fought for haqq, fought for truth. They will be there to actually stay firm. They would not change the principle of the Lord Almighty because they're confident and not dependent on others to define it for them. So what is manhood? He considers his place right because that's what builds his morals. His priorities to support Allah and his messenger. The masajid are their centers. They seek purification in heart, body, and mind. And it's not seeking to change their appearance on the outside. That's not their concern. The concern is not by changing their appearance on the outside. How do I look? Do I have the appearance of a handsome man? And that's extremely sad that right now, even women are not recognizing what it means to actually look for a man that deserves to be the qawwam over her. Basically looking for a handsome man. And right now, I've been doing matchmaking for a long time. And I've even seen how women are starting to change the paradigms and changing the qualities that they're looking for. The qualities that they're looking for before, it was a stable job, it was a religiousness and religiosity, and it was a certain level of, yes, a good family. But right now it's all about appearance. How tall is he? The money is definitely there, but they would judge a picture. Not my type. Why did you just judge a picture? Why don't you ask about him? Why don't you let your family do their job in seeing how committed is he? Because a manhood is not about an appearance. It's not about an appearance at all. How is this person going to be the qawam? Is supposed to be the focus of your question. Is this person deserving to be the qawam that I would be obedient to? Is this person going to be bringing in the security to the and stability to the household? That's what manhood is. Is this person recognizing that building their home on piety and the Lord Almighty's principles as their priority? Or what is this person really committed to? If this person is just committed to their appearance, then this person is living a different center. That's why Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala actually there says, what is manhood? They're رِجَالٌ لَا تُلْهِهِمْ تِجَارَةٌ وَلَا بَيْعٌ عَنْ ذِكْرِ اللَّهِ. They're men. They're not pacified away from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, from the remembrance of the Lord Almighty. And when we say remembrance, we're not just taking a moment of astaghfirullah, astaghfirullah, but we're also talking about, when we're speaking about dhikrullah, when we're speaking about dhikr, we're talking about recognizing it through ilm, knowledge. 2, they're living it in principle to actually live it in practice. 3, They're actually living it in their vision and what they listen to and how they apply it in real life. Why? Because that is only the person when they fear يخافون يوما تتقلب فيه القلوب والأبصار, when they would fear the day when the hearts and the sights are living in extreme fear. Only that person is going to recognize the principles in dealing with you, even when they may disagree with you. That's why the Prophet ﷺ said, لا يفرق مؤمن مؤمنة. A true believing man would not harm a believing woman. Why? Because at the end of the day, رضي منها خلقا. إن كره منها خلقا, sorry, رضي منها بآخر. He may dislike certain behaviors in her, but he will like other behaviors. Manhood is basically committed to dhikr. They're committed to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala because nothing distracts them from their commitment, not wealth, not social interaction, and certainly that's what creates the real rushd, the real rushd, just as the ayah that we read before, the real rushd. In the most, what is rushd? Rushd is basically to live in guidance and vision and action. Rushd, guidance in vision and action. That's why in the ayah that we did earlier, when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, حَبَّبَ إِلَيْكُمُ الْإِيمَانِ, that vision, He made Iman beautiful unto you. That's in vision. And then what? زَيَّنَهُ فِي قُلُوبِكُمْ. It was beautified in your heart. You put it into practice. كَرَّهَ إِلَيْكُمُ الْكُفْرَ وَالْفُسُوقَ وَالْعِصْيَانَ. He let kufr, disbelief, sin, major and minor sin, be something that you would detest, you would hate. Now that's an action. So, أَلَيْسَ مِنْكُمْ رَجُلٌ رَشِيدٌ. It's basically when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, Prophet Shu'aib was telling his people, don't you have a man that is Rashid? Just have a man of guidance. If he is not a man of guidance, he's not containing manhood. Being masculine is being a person of serious missions. But what we're seeing right now is really men in their 20s and 30s and even 40s obsessed with gaming. And it's being presented like it's a hobby. This is not a hobby. The Prophet ﷺ actually said, إِنَّ اللَّهَ جَوَادٌ يُحِبُّ الْجُودَ. The Lord Almighty is generous. He loves generosity. وَيُحِبُّ مَعَالِي الْأَخْلَاقِ. And He loves the highest levels and the most honorable things in morality. وَيُبْغِضُ سَفْسَافَهَا. And He hates and detests the سَفْسَافَهَا, the things that are trivial. Why? Because a man is basically not living to be in the trivial things. So manhood is all about committing to principle despite all the changes. Why? Because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, مِنَ الْمُؤْمِنِينَ رِجَالٌ صَدَقُوا مَا عَاهَدُوا اللَّهَ عَلَيْهِ. They're from the men that are basically sadaqu. They were honest on what the covenant between them and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is. What is it? فَمِنْهُمْ, the word that they were committed to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the principle, and some of them, they basically died on that. They were committed. They were martyrs to die on that. And some of them would wait their next time to actually be part of the martyrs. But the most important thing, they didn't change the principles. They basically lived it. They were committed. But how do I stay committed? You cannot stay committed unless you have the knowledge to help you identify the roads. And that's why He said, وَجَاءَ مِنْ أَقْصَى الْمَدِينَةِ رَجُلٌ يَسْعَى قَالَ يَا قَوْمِ اتَّبِعُوا الْمُرْسَلِينَ. That man that actually came from all the way from the other side, the suburb, the side of the Medina, the side of the city, and he just came and he was coming in a rushing manner. And he said, follow the mursaleen, follow the prophets and the messengers. That is his place of guidance. But there's no way that if they don't have the knowledge, that there's no way that they can actually build the other second stage of what it means to live manhood, which is to live the courage, living the courage to live up to the principle. When you recognize your place of justice, you're patient on living justice despite all the different threats that are probably trying to deter you away from truth. And despite all the advantages or the offers that you're probably getting, but you're living the satisfaction, you're living the iffah, in order to grow even in that capacity, you would basically put, even if it meant your life on the line and your wealth on the line, you're living the courage to actually live to the principle, live the mission, and emulate what the prophets and the prophets and the messengers were living in, the legacy of the prophets and the messengers, despite all the fear, despite all the fear, ready to take all the roads and ready to take the roads to figure out a way to support the truth. And that's why Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala basically spoke about those that are living that principle, living the word, living and committed to the ilm, to actually recognize for the woman what it means to actually find that man that is qawam. So when we speak about qawama, we're first going to be recognizing what it means to be the person of qawam, what it means to be a man, what it means to embrace it. Who am I giving this level to? Who am I choosing to be the person in qawama? But unfortunately, what we're seeing today is many people confused. Why do I need to obey the man? That's because you don't know what manhood is, my dear. Maybe if you would have known what the definition of manhood is, then, and maybe if you would have actually identified not only what it means to have qawama, what it means to live manhood, well, you would also identify, is this person really living up to that level? Is he deserving to be the qawam? If he's not, then reject that person. If you're considering marriage, the Prophet ﷺ says, إذا جاءكم من ترضون دينه وخلقه فزوجوه. The most important thing you want to look for in a husband is basically من ترضون دينه. It's basic. In order for him to be a qawam, you first have to look for their deen. The second thing you want to look is for morality, because those are the two bases that you want to look for in a man, in a qawam. Because if you can't find those, then I don't blame you for confusing. Why do I have to why do I have to have this man to be my qawam? Well, I don't blame you for confusing the elements, because this is the basis of it. If we're not identifying these, then I don't blame you for being confused in the beginning. So what is the description of good femininehood? What is femininehood? What does it mean to actually have this femininehood? If we talked about manhood, so what is womanhood anyways? Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentioned a number of different things. Number one, for femininehood, she recognizes the principles of the Lord Almighty. Same thing. Recognizes the principles of the Lord Almighty. Why? Because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said, فَالصَّالِحَاتِ قَانِتَاتِ حَافِظَةٌ لِلْغَيْبِ بِمَا حَفِظَ اللَّهُ. A true salihah, a true pious woman, same thing as a man, same thing as a woman, where we would basically say recognizes their place of piety, recognizes the center, recognizes their vision, that it's basically Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, recognizes their boundaries, where qanitat, they're basically submitting to the Lord Almighty. Then hafidatul lil ghaib, they're not impulsive in speech, because the word hafidatul lil ghaib simply means they would guard the ghaib. They would guard the ghaib, that what is unseen. They would guard their homes, and they would not go sharing this information left and right to people because she wanted to ventilate. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala emphasized this one because as women, we tend to speak about the different things. We tend to think that it's a way of ventilating. We tend to feel good, and we would speak and not recognize who we should, what information we should share, who we should share it to. We just use that as a form of ventilation. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala describes that women, they're not impulsive in speech or behavior. They preserve the privacies at home and for others, and where they're also firm and confident in on truth. So that's why Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us the story of the wife of Fir'aun and Maryam bint Imran. How are they actually to be the examples for all the believers, not just women, but also the men as well? Where Imra'at Fir'aun, the wife of Fir'aun, she basically said, "Oh Lord Almighty, bring me a castle in Jannah. Build me a castle in Jannah and protect me from Fir'aun and his actions, and protect me from those that are ظالمين, those that are abusers." And Maryam, the wife, the daughter of Imran, that had guarded her private part, and the Lord Almighty had blown in it. And then, but the most important thing, صدقت بكلمات ربها وكتبه. She basically had confirmed and believed in the words of her Lord Almighty and even the revelations, and she was obedient to the Lord Almighty. Well, one thing is, unlike in the men's description was focused a lot in terms of behavior. But there's one thing that is slightly different in women, in where when it talked about womanhood, there was a lot of emphasis in terms of the appearance, how women, and we see that who are the most, the biggest consumers of the different makeup, and basically the different things, even clothing. You would say the clothing, women tend to buy more of that. Women tend to buy more of the makeup. Women tend to be the most to actually make the different plastic surgeries. Women are more focused on their appearance. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala emphasized that women, that a true woman, the true good femininehood is basically not focused on the appearance, but is actually focused on the inner piece of that side of that woman. That's why Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala emphasized in many ayat. Look at this ayat. فَجَاءَتْ إِحْدَاهُمَا تَمْشِي عَلَى اسْتِحْيَاءٍ قالت إن أبي يدعوك ليجزيك أجر ما سقيت لنا فلما جاءه وقص عليه القصص قال لا تخف قال لا تخف نجوت من القوم الظالمين. So what happened? And where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala described that woman that was basically coming to Prophet Musa alayhi salam, that she was coming with bashfulness. She was not trying to expose her inner feelings to Prophet Musa alayhi salam, and she was recognizing these boundaries between her and this man. As a matter of fact, she was basically walking in complete bashfulness, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala basically emphasizes that part of womanhood that is extremely important is not to expose herself, not to expose not what happens at home, not to expose herself. So basically living in some form of learning how to maintain her honor, because the more you expose yourself, the more you expose your home, the more you expose your body, the more you expose your feelings, that's when you lose your honor, you lose your haiba, you lose your dignity. Because the more you are exposed to people, the more you are exposed to others, that's when people will know how to get to your places of weakness. That's when people will transgress your limits. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala basically emphasize what it means to live womanhood, what it means to live an honorable woman is basically the woman that does not live to her impulsive reactions, to her impulsive feelings, to her own feelings of how she wants to, what makes her feel good about herself, but she actually learns how to maintain a level of stability from what she feels to actually living and letting her own emotions succumb to the principles of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and the principles of akhlaq. Now, this is important to mention because generally women, they don't necessarily live like that. They're more susceptible to actually living in place of ease and focus on beauty and emotions, and they're more susceptible to living in that way, which is why Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had mentioned زُيَّنَ النَّاسِ حُبُّ الشَّهَوَاتِ مِنَ النِّسَاءِ. Women, they basically recognize that they would more be a place of importance, or at least place of attraction whenever they're exposed to men, because they're basically the treat for men. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us that there's a common thing, and this is not mentioned in order to tell women to behave in that way, but this is actually mentioned that this is part of your instinct, but you got to be careful from it. You got to be careful from it. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala would tell us here that most people, they basically, and people, it was beautified to them to love the lust towards women, the children, and basically the gold and the silver and all the different cattle and so forth. But Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentioned that it's also a different way of reading it, that for women do recognize that a lot of times certain men may actually treat you as if you are important just because you had exposed certain beauties of yourself or exposed yourself in certain way. Only a manipulated woman would think that is giving her honor. Only a woman that is manipulated and does not recognize that he is not necessarily honoring you, but he is basically using you for his own lust. That's not necessarily honor, but that's more of trying to use you as a trait. But in order for him to actually honor you is really when he recognizes that he must live up to the principle and the nature in where he recognizes that women are the center of family making, that when the woman recognizes that this man is supposed to be as qualified or a person to live up to, one, being able to bring support to the family, bring security to the family. That is the only time that this man is going to deserves to be basically the place of a woman's center. If this man is not living there, and that's the same thing for a woman, that the man should also consider that this woman, and the only woman that he needs to look for, that's why the Prophet ﷺ actually said in the hadith, فَاظْفَرْ بِذَاتِ الدِّينِ, the most important woman that you want to connect with, really, فَظْفَرْ, with the word dhafr basically means it's like you're getting it as a reward, the best reward that you would get. When other people are looking for beauty, they're probably looking for status, money, and probably race, etc. فَاظْفَرْ بِذَاتِ الدِّينِ, look and get the reward. In other words, choose the woman of deen, or else تَرِبَتْ يَدَكَ, everything else would basically wear out with time, would wear out, and with the only thing that will remain, you got beauty will wear out, the money will go away, all the other things would wear out. The only thing is to remain is basically the principle. And that's the same thing for a woman. The most important thing that you want to recognize for womanhood is she capable of maintaining family? Is she capable of taking care of her children? Is she capable of disciplining the children? What is she really doing? How is she living up to that principle? And that's why the Prophet ﷺ did actually speak in a number of different things, warning women of how at many times women may get carried away with so many different things, and where the Prophet ﷺ said, "Ya ma'shar al-nisa, tasaddaqan fa inni ra'aytukunna akthara ahli an-nar." Oh women, give sadaqah. Why give sadaqah? Because I had seen that most of the dwellers in hellfire are actually from the women. So one of them said, "Wabima, why? What do we do? Why do we deserve that? Why did most women deserve hellfire?" So the Prophet ﷺ said, "You damn things. You're constantly looking at things from a negative eye. You're constantly complaining. Yes, you are much more susceptible to probably living depression, anxiety, all these different things. But then you constantly damn things. You're constantly living this feeling, and you're letting those feelings come out in your words, where you're constantly complaining about everything, and you would deny all the good things that the man might have actually done to you. So you rush to basically complaining about everything, and you rush to do what? To actually only look at the missing things, not the advantages that you have. Maybe it's because we're more susceptible to depression. Maybe it's because of hormonal things, but that is not whatsoever a reason to basically give us a justification to live that. Because if that was the case, then hey, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, in regards to jihad, men are supposed to be doing jihad, but Allah Ta'ala basically tells us that كُتِبَ عَلَيْكُمُ الْقِتَالُ وَهُوَ كُرْهٌ لَكُمْ. You were ordered to engage in battle, to engage in jihad, and it is hated on you. In other words, not because you might hate it, not because it might be part of your nature. That doesn't give you the justification to do it. It basically gives you the knowledge to know that you are more susceptible to this fitna, and that you have to increase the amount of effort, the amount of jihad of the nafs. You have to increase the amount of jihad of the nafs, and which is why Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala actually says, وَأَمَّا مَنْ خَافَ مَقَامَ رَبِّهِ وَنَهَى النَّفْسَ عَنِ الْهَوَى. Whoever fears the status and considers the status of the Lord Almighty, and they prevented the nafs from getting carried away with their desires and whims, those are the ones to deserve Jannah. In other words, the women to really deserve Jannah, and the women to really live what true femininehood is, are the women to go beyond their inner emotions that may actually lead them to constant complaint, to constant denial that they're getting advantages, or to recognize what their husbands are doing. And they basically, when they're constantly damning things, those are the women that are living to their whims, that are living not necessarily to the principle, but letting their own feelings generate the behavior for them. That's why Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us that women may natural things that may affect their behavior, but are still held accountable. That's why Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, that's why the Prophet ﷺ actually said in regards to women, كَمُلَ مِنَ الرِّجَالِ كَثِيرٌ. There are many men that reach the level of probably being near perfect. وَلَمْ يَكْمُلْ مِنَ النِّسَاءِ إِلَّا. Only very few women were living near perfection. Number one was Aysha, the wife of the Pharaoh, Maryam bint Imran, and Aysha was basically preferred over a lot of women, just like he preferred her over a lot, just like one might prefer one particular food over other foods. This hadith is narrated by Bukhari and Muslim. And Ibn al-Qayyim actually comments on that, and he said Islam had laid out that men and women are generally equal in different forms of rituals and worship. And yet when we're talking about, of course, when we're talking about different actions in terms of bodily actions, in terms of ritual, and certain things, even in terms of finances, whether you're talking about wudu, salah, siyam, zakah, hajj, you're talking about certain differences between men and women. And same thing when we're talking about criminal law, whether we're talking about al-hudud, whether we're talking about life, and whether we're talking about the different assigned criminal law punishments. But then some things Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had made as half, such as when we're talking about blood money, or even witnesses, or even when we're speaking about inheritance, or even aqiqah. Why do we actually do aqiqah, one share, one goat for a girl and two for boys? Why did the blood money actually be half for where a man, it's basically the woman's blood money is half? Why? Well, that's one thing, is that these differences are not necessarily the differences in their humanhood, but those differences are due to the roles they contribute. So a woman's dia, the dia is certainly not to compensate for their life. The dia is to compensate for the financial contributions they actually give to the family. So the differences are in the roles and not to the differences in nature, which is why Ibn al-Qayyim actually explains this one. He said, because when we're talking about maslahat al-ibad, when we're talking about what is actually in favor of the different people, whether we're talking about the bodily, or even we're talking about the when we're talking about criminal laws and etc., they would actually be the same in terms of men and women. But then you would actually see that certain differences are there, whether we're talking about Jum'ah, or whether we're talking about the congregation, etc. These different things, or even jihad, basically because of the differences in their nature. So therefore, when we're speaking about the differences in nature, that is basically when you would see the different rulings and laws. But the general rule is what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said: whoever does good from male or female, and while they're in their faith, then the Lord Almighty bring them a life of good and piety, and the Lord Almighty would reward them better than what they had actually done. And that's why even Jibreel alayhi salam, he comes down. Look at this hadith in Bukhari. اقرأ على خديجة السلام من ربها ومني وبشرها ببيت في الجنة من قصب لا صخب فيه ولا نصب. Jibreel comes in a special telegram message, a special message coming from the top, coming from the Lord Almighty. It was just Jibreel alayhi salam, just coming for one reason. Ya salam. Give Khadija salam from her Lord and from me. Jibreel alayhi salam coming down just to give salam from Allah Almighty to Khadija, and from Jibreel to Khadija, and tell her and give her glad tidings of a Jannah made of qasab, made of, what is qasab? How can I don't know the word in English, so we'll get it next time, inshallah. In where there is no loud noise, and there is wala nasab, and there's no tiredness in Jannah. Tell her she will get a castle in Jannah. Ya Allah, this is Rahib. Now, here's one thing, is that some of these conversations of superiority, inferiority, and all of that, some of that discussion was actually there during the time of the Prophet ﷺ, but there was that answer where Salama, she basically said, "Oh Prophet of Allah, I see that men are always mentioned in the Quran, and then women are not mentioned." That's when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala revealed, well, the Muslim men and the Muslim women, the believing men and the believing women, the qanit men, that in other words, the pious men and the pious women, the honest men and the honest women, the patient men and the patient men and the patient women, the men that are living in khushur, that are living in sincerity, and the women that are living in their sincerity, and mutasaddiqin wal mutasaddiqat, those that would donate, the men and the women that donate, the women and the women that basically fast, and those that guard the private parts from the men and the women, and those that would mention Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala from the men and the women, all of them, they were basically prepared. It was prepared for them maghfirah, of forgiveness, and a great, magnificent reward. So at the end, believing men and believing women, it's not a battle. It's basically that they support one another on the main center, which is the mission of Islam. Which is why Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, وَالْمُؤْمِنُونَ وَالْمُؤْمِنَاتِ بَعْضُهُمْ أَوْلِيَاءُ بَعْضٍ. The believing men and the believing women, they are awliya. They're supporters of one another. They're an authority over one another. What do? They've got a mission to order for what is good and forbid what is bad. And they would perform salah because they recognize that their direction is to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And they recognize that the energy that they had spent in making money and all of that is basically to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And at the end, they obey the Lord Almighty and His Messenger. Those are the people to really be embraced in the mercy. So therefore, that feminism, masculinism battle is another jahiliyyah. This misogyny and misandry, they're both also another form of jahiliyyah. But that's in order to understand that qawama, manhood and patience, it's all about responsibility. And that's why Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, when He spoke about rijalu qawwamuna ala nisa, it's basic order to lay out the foundation, that financial responsibility, وَبِمَا أَنفَقُوا مِنْ أَمْوَالِهِمْ, basically the financial responsibility, basically the decision making. The relationship is that one would complete another, but the completion also demands a structure and a management. And that's why Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, وَلَهُنَّ مِثْلُ الَّذِي عَلَيْهِنَّ بِالْمَعْرُوفِ وَلِلرِّجَالِ عَلَيْهِنَّ دَرَجَةٌ. They're not necessarily entirely equal in their responsibilities and in their duties to one another. In fact, the ayah was really clear and said, وَلِرِجَالِ عَلَيْهِنَّ دَرَجَةٌ. In fact, there's a higher responsibility on women towards men than the other way around. Is it not entirely equal? Yes, it's not entirely equal. Why? Because He basically said, الرجال قوم على النساء. They're basically, the men are basically responsible in making sure that they're basically making the right decisions and taking care of the responsibilities and so forth. But women have a responsibility to be obedient. Then therefore, why is the man responsible and the person in charge? It's basically a taklif, not a tashrif. It's basically a responsibility. And it's not necessarily a role of honor. That's because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had given the men the physical responsibility, basically had given them that they have to figure out the solutions. Women, on the other hand, most of the solutions are actually prepared for them by nature. Their financial rights are to be covered to ensure that her major motherhood responsibility is covered and secured. But unfortunately, what we're seeing right now is that feminism is basically wanting women to get into the manhood responsibility, and they would think that it's supporting womanhood, when in reality it's just making it harder on women, because at the end of the day, the relationship between men and women is basically to bring about a sukoon, the tranquility. That's why Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said, uskun anta wa zawjuka al-jannah. Be to, or uskun means to dwell, but it also means to live in tranquility. You and your wife live in Jannah. That was for Adam alayhi salam. But the main thing, هو الذي خلقكم من نفس واحدة. He's the one that created you from one nafs, created you, جعل منها زوجها, created from it its own air. In order to do what? ليسكن إليها. In order to find tranquility, to find peace, to find security. And at the end, this is the main place for marriage. This is why Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala created this nature to be different from woman and men. At the end of the day, لَيْسَ الذَّكَرُ كَالْأُنثَى. Men and women are different than one another. And that's why Islam forbid that women imitate men and men imitate women. And because at the end of the day, the second you remove these differences, then you're actually committing an injustice. You're committing an injustice. And that's why Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, from the very beginning, the Prophet ﷺ said, إِنَّ هَذَيْنِ حَرَامٌ عَلَى ذُكُورِ أُمَّتِي حِلٌّ لِإِنَاثِهِمْ. Speaking about gold and speaking about silk, those are haram on the men to wear, even if it's a garment, let alone a behavior. And the Prophet ﷺ actually said, three don't enter Jannah, and the Lord Almighty would not look at them on Judgment Day. One, al-aql waliday, the one that is disrespecting his parents, and the woman that is imitating men and starts to dress like men, and the youth, and the man that is the youth that is not there to guard his woman and his sisters and his family members. He's basically at the youth. He's not even having the jealousy to guard them. So at the end, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, yes, there are some things that they would basically have in and share in humanity. That's why the Prophet ﷺ said, فَكَأَنَّهُنَّ شُقِقْنَ مِنَ الرِّجَالِ. That women here, sorry, إِنَّمَا النِّسَاءُ شَقَائِقُ الرِّجَالِ. The Prophet ﷺ said, إِنَّمَا النِّسَاءُ شَقَائِقُ الرِّجَالِ. That women are the brethren of men. And al-Khattabi, who basically in al-Khattabi explains as if they were created, or they were split from men. I actually, inshallah, I have to end here. Looks like something important has happened. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, everyone. Assalamu alaikum.